Shalom, Tamar here, and today I want to talk about tithing in the Torah. I want to chat about this from one Torah follower to another, from one scholar to another, and because this is a very interesting topic in the Torah that has real-life practical applications for so many people. And I want to also highlight the Torah's compassionate system for the poor. It has a financial solution and system worked into the Torah that is simple and yet very profound in its implications in creating a society that thrives on work and trade and business, but also makes room and accommodation for those who financially need assistance. And I want to highlight specifically who the tithe is for. Many people who have come home to Torah have rejected the concept of tithing to upkeep a church building, and they're not that far off. In the Torah, we know that the Most High commanded the children of Israel to give their gold and their silver, their leather, their oils, their ram skins, wood, and the complete list is in Exodus 25 and 35 to build the tabernacle of Elohim. And it was supposed to be built in a very specific way. And these modern times are not the first time that a collective body of people have rejected this notion that we should pay tithes to upkeep a church building. In the late Renaissance period, early 1700s, there were theologians and people who identified as pastors or preachers that met in fields. They were not willing to take tithes for a church building. And I think this has a huge significance because the tithe was specifically created to be for four specific populations: the Levites, the Gers, who were people coming home to the land of Israel, the widow, and the fatherless. And if a preacher takes a tithe to pass out to the widow and fatherless, that's great. But there isn't a command in the Torah for us to give our money for the upkeep of a building. Of course, we've lost genealogical records of knowing who the Levites are, so that command, although it's eternal, is muted in our time. Unless we're in the land of Israel, we cannot claim who's a ger and who's not. So that leaves the widow and fatherless. Widows, by definition of the Torah, almana, is a woman who buried her husband. And I want to talk about maintaining a strict definition of that, because sometimes there's a tendency to stretch that definition. And there is a reason that the Torah does not stretch it farther beyond a woman who has buried her husband. There is still a lot of compassion for divorced women and the poor in the book of the Torah. And of course, if a divorced woman is fatherless and she is abandoned or deserted by her husband, she still can take the tithe as an adult woman who has no father. But traditionally in the Hebraic culture, a divorced woman, when deserted, was cared for again by her father and mother, who would often take a ketubah amount for her, although that's tradition and not commanded. The fatherless are often spoken of in Scripture as a group package with the widow. They aren't seen separate from the widow often. There's only one passage in Leviticus where you see something given to the poor and the fatherless. But the fatherless were children, and adult children and minors, whose father was actually deceased. It was known there's no hope of reconciliation, no chance that they will be restored to their father. And this tithe to the widow and fatherless being limited to those who actually have experienced a death in the family does not mean that I'm saying there's no compassion for children, adult or otherwise, minor children, that have been estranged or abandoned by their father, there still is a network built into the Torah, which I'm going to expand on, to help those who have been estranged or abandoned. And I want to expand on why the Torah specifically points to those who have experienced a death in the family. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I believe the tithe for the widow and fatherless is less about provision and more about giving a tribute to the woman as a widow for nation building in the house of Israel. The women of Israel were commanded not to intermarry with the men of the outside nations. And in going with that, they were told not to take the seed of those men. So the women within the house of Israel who married men in the house of Israel and then experienced a death were given a tribute through the tithe because they built up the nation of Israel through their marriage with that Israelite man. And limiting this tithe, that works like a tribute because you have to think about this. It never says to only tithe to the poor widows. What about a woman who's a widow and left with a multi-million-dollar estate? The community would still give her a tithe. And in that way, it's not functioning as a sustained provision. It's a tribute to her for building the nation of Israel. And limiting this tithe to widowed women and fatherless who have experienced a death is a way of also honoring the men of Israel. Because if the tithe was stretched to include divorcees or women that broke the command and fornicated with men who were not Torah observant, it creates a culture in which making men obsolete is rewarded. Limiting the tithe to the widow and fatherless honors this concept of a family with a man and a woman who built up the nation of Israel. And I'm not saying that there's no compassion for the divorcee and the woman who fornicated and repented and is in the house of Israel and needs financial provision. But there is actually a secondary system of providing for the poor, which may include a single mother, a single father, a divorcee, or a divorced man. And in Leviticus 25:35, it says that if a member of the community has become poor, we are to assist them. And then it goes on to talk about loans. So in Leviticus 25, we see that we are supposed to assist those in the house of Israel, divorcees who have possibly been abandoned or deserted, and women who have previously broken the command not to intermarry with men who don't follow the Torah and are still left to care with children. So in that assistance in Leviticus 25, it says to help them help themselves. Assist them. So this might be giving them your skills, helping them build a small business, and lending them money. In Deuteronomy 25, let me double check that. Actually, it's Deuteronomy 15:8. It talks about our obligation to give loans to those in the house of Israel. There was no credit check. Credit checks and credit scores of the nations can actually become very oppressive. But in the book of the Torah, we are supposed to, when we have it in our capacity and power, to give loans to those in the house of Israel that need to sustain themselves or build a business so that they can work. The first layer of that is we are all commanded in Exodus and throughout the Torah to work 6 days. And Torah preserves that dignity of work for the poor and for divorced people. You could even argue that even the widow can work when she has completed her mourning, but I don't really want to branch out on a debate, but rather I want to emphasize that even though there is no tithe to a divorced person or to the poor or a single parent, it doesn't mean there's no compassion in the Torah for helping them. Leviticus 25, we can give our skills, our time, whatever it is they need to help themselves. And there's even a verse in Leviticus 25:39. That person has the option of hiring themselves as an employee to a wealthier Israelite. So working on their estate, working on their homestead, working in their business. And the beautiful thing of that is that the Torah empowers people to work. If you look at the woman in Proverbs 31, she's a businesswoman. There really is no concept in Hebraic culture that if a woman is deserted or abandoned by a man, let's say he just gets up and leaves, and that situation deserves compassion when it's not her fault that she was deserted. Or let's say a Torah sister previously married a man who didn't follow Torah against the commandments. She intermingled among people in the nations. There's still compassion through help. There's compassion through loans, through helping her sustain herself and helping her build her own wealth. Women were encouraged and given equal legal and social rights to obtain loans and build businesses, and shopping their businesses as a community was another way of helping them. Maybe assistance could be through supporting their business. There's another layer of compassion for the poor. Two more, actually, I want to expand. Every 7 years, those loans that a divorcee or that even a widow, because the Torah talks about a widow at times needing to take loans, or a single parent needing to take loans, every 7 years, those loans were forgiven. So in this way, while the Torah is driving us towards being motivated to work, it also levels it with compassion, because if a person is getting to the point where they're taking out loans and taking out loans and taking out loans to survive, they get mercy every 7 years. So they're working and borrowing, and the slate is wiped clean every 7 years, and that's merciful. In addition to Leviticus and Deuteronomy giving the option of assistance, employment, and loans to the poor and to those who need help, whatever their station is or marital status, the Torah also provides for the poor to be able to be given charity through food. So in Leviticus 23, it says the poor are entitled to take grain, crops, and grapes. And that's really interesting because one of the leading causes of death or from heart disease is lack of whole grains. But in giving the poor grains, crops, and grapes, they have enough to maintain the nutrients that they need to be healthy. And the grapes could even be turned into wine for medicine. The book of Proverbs talks about taking medicine in moderation, wine as medicine in moderation. Every 7 years, outlined in Exodus 23, there's also a 7-year harvest of grain, crops, and grapes at a time when the poor can pull in a lot more. And there's one additional crop that every 7 years the poor was entitled to take, and that is olives, which is really neat because they could be crushed for selling the oil, or they can be used to maintain the muscular system, which relies on healthy fatty oils. So in addition to that, food given to the poor and the ger and the Levite, but I want to focus on the poor, the widow, and fatherless, because getting into who are the Levites and how do we define a ger when we're living outside the land of Israel gets a little bit off the path of the subject here. In Deuteronomy 24, the widow and fatherless are also entitled to take grain, olives, and grapes. Crops and fruit trees are mentioned in Leviticus 27. And the widow and fatherless are also entitled to take a tenth of animals in the community. Every 3 years, there was also a harvest, and the widow and fatherless took 1/10 of that, spread among all the widows and fatherless in the community. And every 3 years, the community was also supposed to take the identical items they were told to give in Exodus 25 and 35. It's repeated in 35 for building the tabernacle, and those were to be given to the widow and fatherless as well. 1/10 of that every 3 years. It was to be distributed. And that included gold, silver, bronze, ram skins, acacia wood, oil, leather, spices, stones, fragrant incense, fine linen, and 3 colors of yarn, blue, purple, and scarlet. And these would allow the widow and the fatherless in their time of mourning to sustain themselves, because perhaps in this mourning, they were paralyzed in a way from working. So, of course, after they are healed from their mourning or cease their mourning or diminish their mourning, they can continue to work. But again, I want to emphasize that I don't believe this system of reserving the tithe for the widow and fatherless is unfair to other populations in the community that are grieving some other issue. There's many troubles one can encounter in life. But again, and I've meditated this on a lot, why would the Most High single out widows and the fatherless who have experienced a death in the family to be given this tithe? A tithe that was in the same standing of the Levites who did a deed that was so profoundly righteous that they and their descendants would be honored forever. It's because this tithe to the widow and fatherless is less about providing for them and more about being a tribute to the widow and her household for nation building the house of Israel. And this can't be done to other populations because the widow has experienced a final situation. Like, it's done. The person is dead and they're not able to come back. And laying this tithe at the household of the widow and fatherless is a way of the community honoring this woman's work in nation building in the house of Israel, which was so important. And this also honors her husband, who was part of the house of Israel. This honors the system of marriage and lifts up men as well for their contribution to nation building as a man in the house of Israel. So I want to encourage those who are seeking help in the community to understand their options that are available. And I want to encourage the house of Israel to remember this tithe to the widow and fatherless, to keep it and to honor those who have built the house of Israel as widows and honor their household in this tithe. We are commanded to keep this, and it's a command put on the people of Israel to seek out those widows. They are to initiate finding the widows and the fatherless and their households and giving it to them. And I would also say Leviticus 25 should also be initiated by people in the community. When we see our brothers and sisters pleading for help or even silently struggling, we have a duty to help them through employment, to help them build businesses, to give them loans, and to give them temporary assistance to sustain themselves so that they don't fall into despair. The Torah has a beautiful system which levels hard work ethics, trade, and business with also compassion and caring for the poor. And when we really dive into these concepts, we see that it looks very different than what might traditionally be a plate passed around to be given to sustain physical buildings. And yeah, one could argue that we can do that in our free time for a gift and an offering. But at the same time, the widow and the fatherless, by command of Torah, are the first, with the Levites and the Gers, entitled to the tithe. And also, those in the community needing help are entitled to that help before non-tangible objects that are not humans. Shalom to you, and thanks for joining me in this Torah chat with Tamar.